I'm here with Greg Tate, author of Flyboy and the Buttermilk, and we are going to be talking about lyricism and specifically music and literature. Cool?
Do it one more time.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right, so I'm here with Greg Tate, the author of Flyboy and the Flyboy and the Buttermilk, and we are going to be talking about music and literature. Cool. So first things first, what got you started in criticism?
I read Amiri Baraka's book, Black Music, when I was about 15, and that's the book that made me want to be a writer, made me want to listen to jazz, and made me start thinking critically about music. Because like everybody else up to that point, I just listened to music, you know. But I got intrigued by the whole process of trying to transliterate your impressions of music into prose, into critical thought, into the advocacy aspect of the thing, into the racial politics aspect of the thing. But it also led me to start reading Rolling Stone magazine on a regular basis, because I was, even though I became a young jazz snob, I was still listening to funk and rock, you know. I was, without knowing it, preparing for my life's work, you know. When I got to Howard University in the mid-'70s, I started writing criticism formally for the Howard's student newspaper, The Hilltop. Wrote some pieces for a magazine that some independent journals, some friends and I, put out called Ushabab. And that eventually led to writing my first pieces for The Voice in '81.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. And what was it that, and as it prepared you, what was it about hip-hop was it hip-hop itself right away? You knew something had to be analyzed, or was it just that this music form came about and you already had this background?
Well, it was interesting because I wasn't even, I wasn't necessarily even thinking about a career in journalism when I was at Howard. You know, I actually was majoring in film and minoring in journalism, you know, and was doing a lot of radio too, a lot of radio broadcasting at the same time. So, hip hop kind of begins with Rapper's Delight, and then there's a quick succession of records that follow. But I didn't start writing professionally until The Voice, Village Voice. Robert Christgau at The Voice asked me to just become a regular stringer, while I was still in D.C. And so my interest is in writing about all the black music, because that's what I was listening to. Like when I moved to New York, I brought about 5,000 albums.
Oh my God!
Yeah, So
where did you move in?
That's a whole crazy story too, because there's actually two women friends of mine that actually brought it up in a truck.
Oh my!
Because I had already moved up here, so they went and got them out of my mother's house. That was love.
I love it.
But
what was the scene like then with? For me, the only ones I know that were, analyzing black music were the Stanley Crouches and the...
No, I can't, it's like the Source magazine recognized myself and two of my colleagues from The Voice at that period as what they called the, air quotes, godfathers of hip-hop journalism. So it's Nelson George and Barry Michael Cooper, who started writing before me, and... in retrospect, I realized we were doing like an interesting kind of triangulation because Barry was very interested in writing about the relationship of hip-hop artistry to the culture of Harlem and the Bronx and Brooklyn, as he had known it growing up in those places. Nelson was very interested in the entrepreneurial aspects of it, the kind of breakthroughs it was making into the recording industry, culture industry. And I was interested in kind of critical theory and aesthetics, and applying, some of those perspectives to talking about this emergent art form or emergent culture,
And the voice and the mythology of it, or just like, did it start out that way? Did it?
Well, it was. I was really interested in making connections between what was going on in hip hop creatively or expressively and what had gone on in previous forms of black music, the way it assimilated and transformed, those influences. So I did a lot of kind of comparative analysis, between what MCs were doing, what jazz musicians were doing, what rock musicians had done, what soul, R&B artists had done, but I was always also interested in what the culture, what the music signified about where black people were in the late 20th century.
Yeah.
What kind of leverage, what kind of access, what kind of insights, revelations could be derived from what was going on in hip-hop culture. Yeah.
And as far as the criticism that has been coming out since all of this, do you think that it's been sufficient, or that we are still kind of looking at hip-hop through a very misguided lens? Do you think that we've kind of given it its...
No, not at all. I mean, I think one of the things that hip-hop did that no other form of black music before it had done was it actually created a whole generation of writers, of black writers and critics about the form as it was emerging. To a certain extent, that had gone on with jazz and R&B in the black press of the 30s and 40s and 50s, 60s, but it was never really kind of consolidated around as a mission, for a whole generation of writers. So when I think about what people refer to as the golden age of hip hop, which is probably still going on in some shape or form. But so when to a certain extent, people look at those years between Rapper's Delight and
Public Enemy, NWA.
Oh, even beyond, I would say all the way up to about 95.
Okay.
Up to
before that Source Awards incident.
No, it's funny. I mean, different people have different markers for when hip hop became corporatized. What I want to say? No, I won't say destructive way, but in a way that kind of took the authentication of the culture away from the audience and kind of put it more in the hands of the corporate suite, And for me, it's the moment in which Puffy had a #1 rap record, because at that point nobody who actually couldn't rap had ever had a #1 hit making a rap record,
And because he was the one to get the #1, it was like...
Yeah, even though, that's debatable too relative to, Vanilla Ice and...
all the other ones.
What's my man?
Vanilla Ice or not Vanilla?
No, Vanilla Ice and... God, man, I don't know why I can see my brother, wore the harem pants and...
Oh, MC Hammer.
MC Hammer, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. But in terms of New York hip hop, certainly, when a certain kind of aesthetic had been established and audience validation was critical to having a hit, that was like a turning point,
Yeah.
But I mean, it's the point at which you could say Video killed the rap star, too.
Did Video kill every art form?
Well, that was like, I think that was the first video that MTV first video MTV broadcast.
Okay.
I think it was Video Killed the Rock Star.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But it's the point at which the visual presentation became as important, or maybe more important over time, as what was going on musically and lyrically. You know, so but that, you know, that's 90s New York.
Sure.
Purist talk.
Did you ever get into it with Stanley Crouch? Because I know he was very against.
Oh yeah, well, you know, I refer to Stanley as like my Uncle Stanley.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because we used to chop it up at The Voice all the time. You know.
Did he ever come? Does he ever come around to hip hop?
I mean, it's funny, 'cause, you know, the period in which hip hop began to emerge is a period in which he finally acknowledged that that Bob Marley was a great poet. You know.
Wow.
So you know, there's always like a latency period with Stanley. You know? And he also, I mean, certain things, I think, you know, and this is kind of one of the dangers of working as a professional critic is you become invested in holding a certain point of view because that's your polemic, or that's your rhetoric, you know, that's your propaganda. You know, so hating hip hop became part of who Stanley Crouch was as a critic. But I mean, you could get Stanley to acknowledge on a case by case basis that something was going on.
Okay.
You know, with certain people, certain writers. You know, yeah.
Yeah, he's. I really enjoy his criticisms, and I always love how people like yourself and just that force people to think other than. And I love what Henry Louis Gates says in the foreword too, where it's like, we may not always agree, but at least you have like formidable arguments that are going on that make you think,
right,
you know, a different kind of way. Yeah. And so, with that, do you think?
Yeah. And I mean, you need the, you know, the stonewalling of a Stanley Crouch to kind of sharpen your critical saber.
Yeah.
Yes, you know, it would be kind of boring.
Right? Yeah, he forces you to have an opinion and then to also have the courage of your convictions.
Oh, yeah.
And because he will go. So I think that what this sets up, and why I guess a lot of people that are inspired by it too, is because it's like you can do the research and you can still have this conversation in a way that's like, you know, there's still an everydayness to it. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's just a very relaxed kind of approach to it. What do you think hip-hop's effect on language has been?
Well, I mean, on if we're just talking about conversational speech, it's everywhere. Sure. You know, I mean, we just heard Madonna give a speech where she talked about nobody messing with her when she was with Sean Penn because Sean would put a cap in your ass. You know, you know, there's just a long. I mean, you're really looking at the way in which what people call black talk or black speech is mutated and transformed people's whole notion of what American English is, as opposed to Oxfordian English or the King's English. Sure. You know, and
what's about to be like Trumpian English.
Oh, I don't even know if that qualifies as English. That might just be blather, but inchoate blather. But you know, there are whole schools of poetry, you know, beat poetry, black arts movement poetry that come out of black, you know, black speech, black vernacular, the speech of that's emerged from black musicians, you know, as well, you know, I mean, what rap music has done is really popularized the inventiveness, the expressive kind of poignancy of black conversational speech, working class black conversational speech, I would say. But then also the way in which when given the platform of rhyming speech, in that rap provides, you can see people rise to incredible artistic heights in terms of their creative use of language and their ability to really sustain like an aesthetic statement, through the construction of rhymes, the delivery of rhymes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you think that sort of it's infiltrated our general discussions and the way that we have conversations with each other so much that it's challenged the authority of like the dominant narrative? Do you feel that like there's a sense of pushing back against hip hop's effect on?
Well, it's interesting because I think because of the way black culture has become so pervasive in defining what Americanness is.
Yeah.
I don't even know if there is I think that is the dominant narrative. In American culture, black culture is the real dominant narrative, and it's not necessarily one that's it's not sustained by government or wealthy patronage, so it's the popular culture of American to the extent that America has a culture. It would have, in a democratic society, the populist culture would be more definitive. The other idea of culture is something that needs to be kind of more artificially sustained, institutionally sustained. It doesn't have a life among the people in quite the same way.
And what's that other idea of culture?
The academic, the ensconced, the classical as derived from American interpretation of European cultural values, what people call Western standards of beauty, and so forth. The culture that we find in that's anointed in museums, and in the on the Broadway stage and in
I see.
English lit departments and so forth. So there's this great contestation that's always going on in America between the culture that's produced by and consumed by the average American citizen, and then this
hoity-toity.
I guess that's one way to say it.
For lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, right. But the more hierarchical definitions, to kind of split things into high art and low art.
Do you think that's been the division between hip hop being considered literature? That literature is in this very almost the actual elite culture or westernized culture, and then hip hop is this thing.
It's very interesting because I was thinking about your question, or at least the way it was kind of phrased in the email about, is hip hop literature?
Sure.
And I say, the short answer is no.
How come?
Because literature isn't something that exists as this defined category in nature. It's amplified or sustained by the fact that it is institutionalized, that it does have its own what I would call industrial complex inside the academy, so that if we're talking about literature with a capital L, in the strictest definition, you're talking about written work that actually has what's been established as a canon in various categories, whether it's novel, plays, poetry, the essay, and the people who are engaged in sustaining that field, that discipline, are people who have very studied familiarity, like with that canon. So in some senses, it's their work, So But at the same time, that's like the short answer, But then the longer answer would be that, that idea that hip hop even has to be considered literature is like it's a forced equivalency, because there's very little that we would consider valuable in terms of black people's cultural production that adheres or meets a Western standard of beauty. It's outside of those canons. It's outside of that kind of institutional support. It's been denied in a lot of places, that kind of support. Jazz just started being taken seriously, within the American Academy, really within, I'd say probably like the last 30 years, and it kind of occurs at the point at which it's the music that black Americans probably listen to the least. But at the same time, you can go, there's about 1,000 college programs in America where you can get a 4-year degree in jazz studies, as an instrumentalist, as an educator. And most of those graduates are, white jazz musicians who are going to become jazz teachers, inside the academy, But, so in some ways, what hip-hop writing does is not in conversation with that literary industrial complex. That's not the reason why people do it. It's not something that those writers don't get up thinking about how am I extending the tradition of Tennyson or T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound, and there may be a couple who are that haven't declared as such, and it doesn't mean that from an appreciation standpoint for that someone who is familiar with those traditions can find a lot of what we would consider equal merit and value in the actual use of the idiom, or the form. But in some ways, what's literature is what's taught as literature, widely, through the academic system.
Yeah.
But there's also, it's somebody who kind of exists in multiple places relative to the whole notion of literature, literary criticism, black culture, hip hop.
Sure.
There's certain kind of proofs or tests to which you'd want to put hip hop writing if you wanted to bring it into the sphere, and one of which is you'd want to see some really knowledgeable, nuanced, sophisticated critics just really take on writing books about the aesthetic of hip hop writing
and offering critical analysis.
And challenging the achievements of the very best people in the form, and putting those between covers, and then that can subsequently become a basis for talking about it in reference to these other ideas of literature. But it would have to be somebody who really was as vested in kind of transforming literature as they knew it and really understood hip hop. So in some of those, I think some of those people are starting to emerge. And Adam Bradley did his book, The Poetics of Hip Hop. He's got another book, The Book of Rap, that anthologizes lyrics, But in terms of, what's interesting is that inside of there's particularly in New York hip hop in the 80s and 90s, the most developed critics were the lyricists themselves. And the way in which they assessed the qualities, of other people in their field, But that was it's like an internal kind of guild critique that was going on there.
And it was wrapped up in the whole remixing of each. I love the creativity of their critiques too, because in order for something to be good, it had to have been sampled or it had to have been, talked about by another MC. So it felt like, I guess they were all wrapped up in one. Like it just.
Yeah. It's I guess it's what people call, in a sense, like living criticism or embodied criticism or, interdisciplinary.
Sure.
Critique of artists. It's the way in which artists kind of build upon one another, and most of the great MCs, as with most jazz, like most great jazz saxophone players, can play you through they can play the history of the saxophone in the style of all the major avatars, and most of the great MCs know most of the great, what they would consider the great canon of lyrics and the lyrical styles, and you can hear them adopt them, in their performance, But I don't know that we've, in terms of formal between covers criticism, I don't know that we've developed a body of critics who are as fluent and fluid and sophisticated, as the writers themselves. Yeah.
I often feel that that's missing too. And with, I hadn't considered it in the parallel universe that you're making. It makes sense. And
that's where black culture exists.
Exactly. And I think I'm probably still of that. Oh, we can all mix. And it'll all But I guess I do see that.
They have gatekeepers. They have
Do
ways.
we have gatekeepers?
Oh, in black culture?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're called record companies. And record executives, and there was this thing called black music departments in the major record companies in the 70s. They had emerged out of the 60s, where for the first time black folks could be executives and actually control the definition of what was R&B and what was market viable, and that went on for about a good 25 years. And what really kind of disintegrated those departments was the emergence of hip-hop, which became something for class reasons. A lot of those executives didn't even want to deal with it. They didn't want to sign it. They didn't want to talk to those artists. Don Cornelius stopped hosting Soul Train because of hip-hop. And so there was this whole class dynamic kind of, and there was an aesthetic dynamic too, because, you could see, when Cornelius does, I think it's the interview with Q-Mo D,
He's very dismissive.
Well, he questions whether it's even music. So, and which in some ways is analogous to your whole question about, hip hop. Can it be literature? You know what I mean? So, because he just couldn't hear it. You know what I mean? It's the point at which, but that whole generation that he represented of kind of black upperly mobile music executives. Became kind of dinosaurs, and in fact, what the labels, the larger parent labels recognized was that they weren't going to have an edge on this emergent form if they were dependent on guys who were in their late 40s and 50s, to find the talent. So that allowed for Diddy's career to happen, and people like Dante Ross, at Elektra, Russell Simmons.
It almost feels like it's its own thing. Then it's like its own world.
Well, I think generally anything, there's this term in literary studies called paraliterature, and it applies to everything that's dismissed as being air quotes real literature, right? So that's genre fiction, so-called commercial fiction, romance fiction, science fiction, mystery novels, and so forth. Novelist Ishmael Reed said he thought that the titles of jazz composition should be considered a form of paraliterature, but and that's him taking the elitism out of the term and almost saying you need to think about it in the same way we talk about the paranormal.
Got it.
You know what I mean? That is something beyond what exists within the set category of the thing. Yeah.
I'm curious, do you think that with how ubiquitous hip-hop has become now, like what the next emerging Black cultural form might be, or what we're moving towards?
Yeah, it was interesting. Like back in the 90s, KRS-One said he thought that hip-hop was really going to be the last original form that Black culture produced. Okay. And at the time I both thought he had a point. They might have been premature. The thing is that what hip hop's engendered is a lot of what we would call subgenres and microgenres. So there's trip hop and there's breakbeat. And then there's a whole debate going on as to whether trap music is actually hip hop. Do you
think it is?
Oh yeah, of course. It's, as my friend Dream Hampton famously said, hip hop is just like blues, like niggas talking over beats. So that's the essence of. If you talk about rap music, it's like that is the essence of it. It's like people rhyming over beats.
Did we pay attention? Did we pay enough attention as general audiences to the words?
I think certainly in terms of what I was at a conference in Durham over the weekend, and somebody in the audience, when they were asking a question, they were talking about it was actually a presentation on trap, and somebody said something about as opposed to elitist New York definitions of hip hop. So, but being a '90s hip hop elitist, that was one of the defining markers of the music, was that the lyrics mattered, that lyric inventiveness and wittiness and originality. Yeah, that mattered mightily, for that period where New York and then kind of LA, through Ice Cube and Snoop and those folks emerged. So yeah, in the '90s, all the way through the '90s, I would say.
The words matter.
Oh yeah, words matter considerably. But they matter considerably to a New York audience. The words in kind of millennial hip hop, the words matter to that audience.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I go to Afropunk every year, and the funniest thing is that based on what's programmed, you assume that that's the music for that audience, but that audience is really there to consume itself.
Yeah, it's
like
true.
The music is like it's
the backdrop.
Yeah, it's a very kind of interesting, esoteric score. But one thing you find is that in between the acts, when they're playing, a lot of times what they'll be playing is like kind of modern, hip hop trap music. And that audience of elaborately coiffed, tatted, and pierced folks know the words to, every Thug or, Jeezy or, Ray something song that goes
I know, I still can't even say his name right. Their names. Yeah. Well, thank you. We're gonna keep waxing on this.
Cool.
And hopefully, like this I think it is definitely creating a good foundation for whatever art form. I hope that KRS-One is not right and that we got some more stuff to offer the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, everything is just is a remanipulation. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, and a lot of times these things start out as marginal. Anyway, you know, people. I mean, you know, the R&B people didn't even think that hip hop was R&B. I mean,
They didn't think it was R&B, or they didn't think it was music.
well, kind of both at the same time. You know, but it was seen as something that was separate and apart.